what can you
Yeah,
do?
no, that was awesome. I mean, yeah, we're live, but congrats, Mike. That was a deep run for our
Thanks.
viewers out there. Mike was dabbling in online poker yesterday and came in fourth. And what was that, a 30K guarantee?
Yeah, and it's good because remember back in the day, I used to catch some terrible breaks. And Dad, I was telling Dan, back then when we had zero bankroll, the psychology behind playing in tournaments, I think that goes into it a lot where you're worried about the buy-in and then it just completely screws you up. And last night I was just playing cards. I was actually trying to win, not trying not to lose. So there's something to be said for that. For anyone that's doing anything, never gamble on something if it affects your actual income. But I think there's a high in that too as a kid, being broke and wanting that cash, where it's like, oh, if I hit this, it's game changing. But
that's what gambling's all about.
Yeah. So but I actually do love the game of poker. I've always just been fascinated by it for numerous reasons. I think I finished The Biggest Bluff this weekend, which was a book you recommended. Great book.
Excuse me. I started reading it.
Phenomenal book. Dan, you'll love it. I think we should read that next week. It's about Eric Seidel, the poker champ. He has a mentee, this woman.
We'll do it on our next podcast. We only have 30 minutes here. Let's dive into what's going on in the markets here.
Big week.
So, yeah, big week. Last week obviously ended with somewhat of a sell-off. NASDAQ, it was really the first 2 days that it was back-to-back down in 48 days, which obviously it's been an impressive run for NASDAQ. And yesterday they came out. Looks like the Republicans put out their version of the stimulus bill. Looks like they're trying to do another round of $1,200 checks. And it looks like they're trying to do 70% unemployment instead of the $600 a week, which I think is still pretty strong. I don't really know how that compares. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the market does. Dad, I know the last few shows you've been wanting to bring up just everything going on with the US dollar. So let's just dive right into that, because gold, all-time highs, keeps going higher. Bitcoin looks like it's starting to follow a similar path as gold. They both seem like they were just in massive rotational mode. So I know you have your eye on that. Why don't you dive into what you're seeing?
Yeah, in fact, I was looking at it right before the show, and the dollar is basically down about 10% since March, which is kind of not the exact correct way to look at it, because it did run up right before it collapsed. And that obviously is short-term bullish for the stock market when the dollar's weak. And obviously it's bullish for gold, bullish for Bitcoin, bullish for any assets that are based on a dollar base. What does it mean? That's the big question. The more Congress talks about handing out money and helicopters dropping money onto people, the weaker the dollar will get. And at some point, if it continues, the dollar's value will start to feel like it's not worth $1 to people. I don't know what it takes to get to that point, but if we do get there, then you're going to have major inflation. There's all kinds of negatives with a very, very weak dollar. The fact that it happens quickly is one of the issues. And that's something to keep an eye on.
And when obviously the common theme that people keep talking about is when the dollar goes down, asset prices go up. But it also seems like there's kind of a point where there's diminishing returns on that. It almost seems like we're knocking on the door there. What happened in 2008 and, the big cycle between 2008 and now, where gold obviously got as high as it went, the dollar came way down. Dollar got really low, didn't it? Wasn't it down like 20 cents more than it is now at one point?
I don't think it was that much, but it did get down quite a bit. Yeah, it could take a lot, but there's certain things going on now that are a lot different. Our deficit is much higher. Before Trump took office, He hinted at the idea of maybe the way to get rid of the deficit is to only pay out 10 cents or 20 cents on the dollar to bondholders like the Chinese. If that was ever to happen, the value of the US in general would just collapse. People would have no faith in the dollar. They would stop using it and forget about going overseas. You just couldn't afford to. So, these are things that probably won't happen, but there's people out there that are starting to talk about it, and that will affect markets at some point if it continues. You can't just keep printing money with no consequences.
That's why I love Bitcoin.
And to add to what you're well, no, I was just going to say a lot of people are starting to talk about it. It seems like it's almost dominating the narrative, which makes me feel like people are overreacting, and this is just part of a bigger cycle, because it seems like whenever everybody starts talking about a specific thing, it doesn't seem to work out that way. So,
this happens anytime there's any type of injection. When you think about it in history, there's a bunch of talk about, oh, there's too much money being printed. It's just naturally going to pop up after what's happening now with these stimulus packages.
Well, you have people like Ray Dalio, who's well-respected, runs Bridgewater Associates, one of the most successful hedge funds. And he's been talking about a weak dollar for quite some time, and deficits. And these talks about high deficits will continue to come back as the dollar gets weaker and weaker.
Yeah. And Dad, I know you like that Mohammed El-Arian guy a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's been, he's been super bearish in the market these last few days, and he does so in a super humble way, where it's not one of these like alarmists. You almost feel good when you hear him talk. But he even tweeted 10 minutes ago, and he goes, while futures to a higher open U.S. stocks and the dollar index sinks, gold is surging, as is silver, and yields on U.S. government bonds are lower. Other than more aggressive central bank intervention, it's hard to find a common theme in all of this. And he was on some podcast yesterday kind of saying the same thing, where he was like, I was a little too conservative over the last few weeks because I sold a lot of my positions 2 weeks ago. He's like, but I will say I'm very, very cautious as to just everything going on right now for the similar reasons as you just said.
Yeah, and it's always difficult to know if it's going to affect the stock market in a big way, and or it just is another one of these alarming stories that just fizzles away, which has been the way of it over the last few years. So it's just something to keep an eye on.
If you something to keep an eye on, but what is the alternative? Like, I always back up here in this stuff.
There's a lot of alternatives. You could play the Australian dollar rather than play gold. The Australian dollar's up about 25%. It's moved. I think I wrote it down here.
That doesn't sit well with me, Dad. I'm not playing Australian dollars.
It moved from 0.55 to 0.71 in the last 3 months, 3 or 4 months.
That's significant.
I don't like the notion of playing a certain currency that's foreign. I don't see that.
No, I mean, you say, what can you do? Different things you can do is you could buy other currencies, or you buy gold,
or you buy Bitcoin, and you just slowly keep adding to it.
Well, these are the things you could do to counter a weak dollar.
Yeah, but then, like you always say, Dad, if you're really actually thinking down the line, what do you then really do to convert that into you could use, where you can go and use it as a store where you're not going to then be affected by a collapsed dollar? Like, how do you really transition it into currency that you're able to use? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think that's where we're heading with Bitcoin, Dan.
Well, the interesting thing is when this has happened over and over again in South America, they've always gone to the dollar, where, okay, we'll take our own local currency, and as soon as we get any, we convert it to the dollar. Maybe that's going to start happening with a different currency. Or people will get to the point where they rather not own currency and they want to own gold again. But that's a real bad situation if it got to that here.
And that's what you're kind of saying. The narrative goes well beyond smart hedge fund managers and investors. Yeah. Almost becomes something that the common public needs to adopt, where, if Joe Schmo down the street is the guy losing faith in the dollar, that's where we have a problem. And to me, that's just not even possible, because this stuff's complicated. And when we talk about what drives the dollar higher or lower in gold, it's not like this is on your everyday person's mind. They're not thinking when the stimulus package is happening, oh, is this actually good for the long-term value of the dollar, or is this not actually? Like that just doesn't go through people's minds.
No, they're trying
it gets into people's minds when they go to the store on Monday and milk is $1 a gallon, and they go on Wednesday and it's $4 a gallon. Then they start to say, wait a minute, what is this dollar worth? What can I use instead of it? That's where it gets to that point. The people in South America weren't thinking about it either. But suddenly, when all the goods that they buy in the store were going up double every day, they realized they needed to get out of the bolivar in Venezuela, or whatever, the currency was in their particular country. I mean, Argentina's gone through this, Venezuela.
So does that mean when those people, was the strategy to convert their currency into U.S. dollar and then go to their local store with U.S. dollar, and it would be accepted? Yeah. Because that's how
Well, a lot of these countries would put in laws that they had to use local currency. So what they would do is they would immediately, when they get paid, they would convert it to dollars. And then when they went to the store, they would just convert enough of the dollars to buy what they needed back into their local currency. And then there would be a black market currency for the dollar and the official currency. And no one traded in the official, because that's not really where it was trading. So they were all kind
it's going to be so fun watching Bitcoin just go to the moon here. Hearing this gets me so amped up.
No, I mean, that's the ultimate shitstorm. Mom and I were in Brazil during one of these inflation periods. Inflation was running, I think when we were there, it was 150%. And every day you go to the store, the prices were up. It was crazy. That's just the way that worked. But they had the dollar to fall back on. If all currencies start doing this, I don't know what they fall back on.
And that's kind of where I was going to go with that, is aren't all currencies almost doing this to an extent? It's not like we're the only ones right now that are printing money to try and bail out our own
economy. Well, yeah, that's why it's what's the best of the worst. Right now, people are saying other currencies are better than the dollar for whatever.
And I will say, well, yeah, and that's something that I guess
even the Canadian dollar has had a big move to the U.S. dollar.
And then the question becomes whether or not that's sustainable or not. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not people have faith if we could actually pay back the debt, right? Or if it's just going to
happen.
Ultimately.
Well, I actually I heard Mark Cuban on some financial podcast this weekend, and he said something that I had never even thought about that really made me actually have a lot of faith in the future of all of this and the fact that we could pay off the dollar. And obviously we're far off from this, but he was saying, like, listen, at some point, robots are going to really become a main thing. Companies are going to use them to be more efficient, and they're going to be able to work at all hours of the night, and they're going to be able to produce just like right now people are. And what we need to do is we need to have those robots pay a tax just like a human would pay a tax, So if, let's say, just for an example, a construction company is using robots to build a house instead of people, those robots need to almost be looked at as people, and they are then paying tax like a person would. And he looks at, like, if you can get to the point where a robot is able to produce the level that humans once were, and then some, because that's how it would be, there's no cap on what you could tax a robot, because they don't need the
I mean,
money
look at
for
our business. It's a prime example. Service, the on-demand delivery business. That's a huge thing. If you remember the Uber CEO, Travis Kalanick, before he left to his investors, he straight up said, we need self-driving in this model for this to be a profitable business. And he was talking about that 5-6 years ago, where that needed to happen around now. And we're seeing the economics with that.
Well, that's all great, but then you have to say, okay, what are people going to do?
No, universal basic income's coming one way or another, Dad.
And what he was basically implying is that if that world does come, there's obviously a whole new set of jobs for people just within that world. And even certain people who might, get left behind like they are now, it would be a transition. It's not like robots would take over the workforce. They would just everything else create a lot of new jobs. But
it'll be like the cash register back in the day, where it created, if you remember, the automated cash register. Before that, it was manual. And there was this big fear about all these cashiers being out of work. It created way more jobs. So I think the biggest fear with humanity is always shelving technology to worry about unemployment. And then there's always this gap in time where everyone needs to catch up. This pandemic has expedited a lot that now needs to come to fruition. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, because we have a lot of the service industry that should be automated, but we need people to be supported with work. So it's an interesting time for sure.
Now people don't have to go to sporting events. They got cardboard cutouts of them.
We could get our faces on cardboards at Giants games next year. That'll be fun.
Well, yeah, it's definitely, that was just an interesting theory. And in my opinion, it made me think, like, okay, there is going to at some point be people who take over that are smart enough to kind of make sense of this debt and how we could actually pay it off and not completely screw over our country.
But, going back to the stock market for a minute, we've had a big move since March, but if you put it over the dollar, the move is not as dramatic. And, part of the move is because of the dollar.
So, Dad, you're feeling bullish?
No, I'm just saying that's the reason we've had a big move.
So what are you looking at this week? I mean, this is going to be a crazy week.
We had huge earnings this week. This is the make or break. We got all the big boys.
Well, yeah, it's going to be.
This literally is a week that's going to be like a critical juncture in the stretch ahead when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how much the stretch ahead even has anything to do with this week, because you could almost lay out to a T what all these companies are going to say. Amazon, like Microsoft, I'm sure is going to have dominant earnings. Does it matter? Are they going to continue to go up? That's a whole nother question.
I mean, I think it matters if any of them shit the bed. Like, we have Facebook coming up,
Yeah, it's tough to imagine that happening. I mean, like, if anyone's going to shit the bed, maybe Facebook, as far as like their advertising goes, just because everything happening and, smaller companies having smaller budgets just due to not being in good situations. But when you think about companies like Amazon, especially with another stimulus package on the way, I mean, people, if they're getting $1,200, half of that's probably going to Amazon. I'm just bullish
personally. I think these earnings are going to lead to another run, like finally hitting that next leg. Like, Dan, you were talking about last week, historically, we usually set up for an August rally with a bit of turmoil at the end of July. Not saying that'll happen again, but I do expect, even what Dad was saying about regardless of the outcome of this election, I think more than past elections, you're not necessarily going to see the volatility with whoever wins. So that comes into play here. I think the biggest issue for short-term problems is Trump going over the China virus in the narrative now hard, where naturally we're going to see some headlines around trade issues, which I'm sure will lead to some short-term headwinds.
Yeah, I mean, look, the market looked like it was going to want to open way higher than it looks like it wants to open now. It's going to be interesting to see if this is just one of those days where, gear up for another big sell-off. Who knows? Like, Dad, what do you think? I see you looking pretty.
I think who knows is the right theme here. You got to really be maybe a little more waiting on the sidelines if you can to see how this plays out. I mean, the stocks that probably get the sigh of relief for the Microsofts of the world, because they don't have the earnings this week, and people may feel comfortable finding names to hide in for a while.
How do you like a Dollar General? Don't they have earnings coming up?
I don't know when their earnings are. If they haven't come up yet,
I look at a company like that. And I think McDonald's does too. I think those are both interesting stocks to look at this week.
Well, we've talked about McDonald's in the past, and McDonald's obviously is a winner in all this.
Well, I know. I just expect their earnings to be impressive because of how things have been set up. So same with Dollar General. I think those could be interesting plays this week that are kind of flying under the radar with all these tech companies.
Yeah, they're also, somewhat recession-proof stocks. Like when you think about the big picture of what's happening here, I'm starting to just think that, this is not necessarily looking like any sort of V. It seems like originally what people thought was the virus was going to just kind of go away. It hasn't, and it's probably not going to for at least a year. So what's happening is it's, in a way, changing people's habits. And all of a sudden people are going out less. That's not just like something that changes on a flip of the switch.
No,
so
it's a new era.
People are more now in the mentality of saving money. And unfortunately, what's happening is if this new stimulus package gets passed and the unemployment's a little bit less, which is going to be, that's a little bit less money people feel like they have. And it seems like companies are starting to figure out how to operate better with fewer people. So I don't really see the unemployment rate going back down. And then you look at what's going on with interest rates so low with buying a house. It's almost setting ourselves up for a repeat of 2008, where people are buying their existing houses, moving to a nicer house that right now they feel like they can afford. And what'll happen is in the next year, when they can't really afford it, they're going to be a little bit tighter on their spending, and they're going to make sure they can pay off their mortgage. That's going to affect the economy. It seems like the economy is maybe not that good. Maybe it's going to.
I don't think this is a repeat at all of 2008 because of the pandemic. I don't think people are in that.
2008. I'm saying I think this is the beginning of just people realizing that the economy isn't in great shape, and there's a lot of people right now that are living paycheck to paycheck that have been putting their money into the economy because for a while the unemployment was so low, and it's going to take months for this to shake out. But yeah, I think there's a lot of realists out there that just think that we're not about to be right back where we were a year ago, because where we were a year ago was a lot of fluff.
There's not going to be ever going back to where we were a year ago. The world's different. It's not like we're just going back to pre-pandemic in a few months ever. It's over. That world's done.
Yeah, so, we'll get back to something that'll look similar eventually.
I think this has changed. I think this has expedited a lot of agendas in different ways, which we'll see coming to fruition in the world in the next year that we're not even witnessing at all right now. So I really don't think things are going to be at all very similar ever again.
Yeah, well, I think we're talking about two different things. So on one end, you're right. Like, obviously, the future always looks a little different. And at the end of the day, the world's going to be a great place at some point, and different things are going to come up from this, and different things will fail because of this, and that's just how it works. I just think that it's tough to imagine it just turns into looking back and being like, oh, yeah, there was that 1 year period where things were weird and then everything went right back to normal. Like, this could easily be what puts us back into somewhat of a recession mode, and maybe the stock market's starting to feel that and starting to.
I don't think so. Look back at the 1918 flu and what happened after that. And back then, we didn't have an infrastructure that even resembled current day. That could have been like the fact that we got out of that in one piece. I'm very, very optimistic.
What happened after that was
the Roaring '20s.
Yeah,
that's what happened after that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about that time period, to be honest, but it just seems like
I think we're heading for a few years of being able to make a ton of money before that ends. I think there's a window coming up here of a huge bull market, and then shit's going to hit the fan in like 5 years. Not hit the fan, but we just won't have wealth generation anymore. the way we could. But I think that personally, I'm very optimistic about what's coming of this for anyone in the market.
One thing that came out Friday is Trump is lowering prices on a number of drugs through various means through his executive orders. And that should be negative for a lot of the big drug companies. And I don't know if it's actually hitting them yet, but apparently like the cost of insulin, which is, one of the most used drugs in the country, is going down pretty dramatically for people that have diabetes.
So my question to you, Dad, is that bullish for like a Quest Diagnostics or something? Like,
no, I don't think it's bullish for them. I think it's negative for the big drug companies. And I don't know which ones particularly, but
is it positive for anybody?
Yeah, it's positive for Trump and the seniors. The seniors are going to feel this big time because their prices could drop.
Well, it was one of his election promises 4 years ago. That's why he's doing this now.
Well, exactly.
100 days.
Yeah, and this came out Friday, near the close or after the close.
Yeah, it's something that people have been, basically campaigning on for years, and something Trump got no credit for.
Well, it was one of his promises, and now we're in the 100-day stretch. This is the home stretch leading into the election, starting now. So you're going to start seeing things coming to fruition from the narrative, at least, with the Trump team from 4 years ago that hasn't been done yet, that he's trying to hammer home to get some of these seniors not voting for Biden.
Yeah, and this maybe the drug stocks will not react that much because they're already kind of in the mode that Biden's going to win, and that's more a negative than a positive. But then this comes out, and if Biden wins, that will end up being reversed somewhat. So who knows? I mean, it's all mixed up right now with what helps, what legislation helps which candidate. And
it's tough to know.
It's really tough to kind of handle.
I think guys
in for another good open and just has been acting great lately is DraftKings.
I was just going to say, Dan, that I was going to tell you guys with looking at the data, with the sports being back now with the cases, I'm bullish on both those stocks this week because we're back in, you had UFC, a lot of fights this weekend, baseball's back, football's coming back, even without fans. I think it's good for DraftKings. You should expect them having a good week.
Yeah. And
it looks like it is having a good day to start out. It's up over $1.
I'm pumped because I'm going to be cash. I own too much of DraftKings. I was waiting to get back in the green on that, and I'll be dishing some of that off at some point.
I think though it's acting in a way like it maybe has a lot more room to run.
I know, Dan. That's why I'm waiting to sell any. I agree with you. I just own way too much of it.
Well, Bob, when you look at charts, like for example, when you look at a chart and you see a Head and Shoulders or you see a cup and handle, how far out does it need to be for it to be validated? Like, are you able to see that within a 1 day trading chart and be like, okay?
No, I mean, look, the longer the chart is, I mean, if you think about charting in general, it takes more time to develop into what you're looking for. And a lot, many times with these Head and Shoulders, you get the instant gratification on a short-term chart. But on a long-term chart, it could turn into a different looking chart pretty quickly. And that's where I like to go away from charting, in that some of these so-called great opportunities don't necessarily turn out that way over time. I mean, charting is great until it's not, and you can't rely totally on charting. I mean, it's just...
No, yeah, you always say that.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting because gold, the people who are super bullish on gold keep looking at it and they're like, this has been the most massive cup and handle chart ever, and it's now like about to completely break out. And then there's people saying Bitcoin kind of followed a similar thing, but gold, like with a super drawn out, where when you really look at like the 10-year chart, it just kind of passed that high again, and now it looks like maybe it's going to just break through 2,000 and go to all times.
I think the other people,
I think with gold, you have to put it into a different currency to see how it's really acting, because the dollar is so much of the move in gold. Like if you look at gold and the Australian dollar, it's not going to look so dramatic.
Yeah, it's funny. No one really presents it that way. So that'll be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. So yeah, let's wrap this up. I think this is going to be an interesting day. That's for sure.
Yeah, tread carefully out there, folks.